I'm good to go. Oh, I see Mr. Lewis. How about a very quick sound check for Mr. Lewis? Welcome back. This is our 34th meeting, the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage. We are in the midst of doing clause by clause by C10 of C10. As you know, of course, we took a little bit of a break to go on to other activities, including a motion that was passed to allow guests to come in and to also receive a document from the Department of Justice. Now, in saying that, we also passed a motion to invite the Minister of Justice once again. I'd like to bring to everybody's attention, you probably know by now through social media, but we did receive confirmation confirming that Mr. Lametti will attend the Heritage, our Standing Committee on Heritage tomorrow, May 18th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern for 1 hour, alongside the Deputy Minister and the other officials who were present last Friday. And Minister Guilbeault will also be attending. So we didn't extend the invitation to him, but I didn't think you would mind if he tagged along and be involved in the proceedings as well. Nevertheless, if you do have a problem with that, you can just simply not ask him a question, I guess. Perhaps that's how it goes. Nevertheless, so that's for tomorrow. And as you've just read, he is coming in for an hour. So I want you to think about this for just a few moments, and we can discuss this later. If now that both ministers have been in, we have what was required from the Department of Justice. Once that is complete, we can start clause by clause again right after. That could be as soon as the second hour, tomorrow or on Wednesday, as we have another meeting then. I will let you think about that for a while, and we can discuss it again later. That being said, the other part of the motion was to invite an expert panel, suggestions from each of the parties represented officially on the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage. We suggested from the Liberal caucus, we have Ms. Janet Yale. If you remember, she was a Broadcasting Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel. She was the chair of that. Welcome, Ms. Yale. Also, from the Conservatives, we're welcoming back Dr. Michael Geist, who's the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-Commerce Law, Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. From the Bloc Québécois, we have Mr. Pierre Trudel, Professor, Public Law Research Center at the Université de Montréal. Welcome back as well. And finally, from the NDP, from the Canadian Independent Music Association, and by no means any stranger of this committee, as he was a former member of this committee, not too long ago, because I was sitting next to him, so I don't want to give my age as well as his. We welcome President and Chief Executive Officer Andrew Cash. Okay, you know how this goes. We're going to start this right away. Now, we're not going to break. We're going to do a full 2 hours if you wish. So there will be lots of time for questioning, but I assume everybody is going to want a bio break in there somewhere. So with your permission, I will find a spot in approximately 1 hour from now to take that break, and then we come back to resume. So let us first start out with Ms. Yale. And of course, these are opening remarks. You can go up to 5 minutes, but we ask that you're not going beyond 5 minutes for the sake of our committee. Ms. Yale, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the invitation to be here today. My panel colleague, Pierre Trudel, and I are very pleased to provide our perspective on Bill C-10. We endorse the federal government's efforts to update the legislative framework governing the broadcasting system to include both media streaming services and sharing platforms. This approach is consistent with our report, which recognized the realities of a borderless online world in which Canadians will seek to access media content based on personal interest, irrespective of platform or technology. Bill C-10 ensures that these new online streaming services, including Netflix, Disney+, and Amazon Prime, as well as sharing platforms like YouTube, are required to make an appropriate contribution to Canadian cultural content. These online services derive significant revenues from Canadian audiences both advertising and subscription revenues, yet face no obligation to contribute. To imagine that in 2021, we would permit these platforms to make money from Canadian audience, Canadian consumers, and Canadian creativity without any corresponding contribution. It defies logic, particularly when our system imposes obligations on now much smaller, less powerful, and less prosperous traditional broadcasters. So in our report, we recommend that as a matter of competitive fairness, that online undertakings be included in updated broadcasting legislation. Our report also made it clear that these regulatory obligations should be restricted to the platforms. That is, if we use the language of the law, undertakings. Individual creators should remain untouched by regulation, and that's exactly what Bill C-10 proposes. So let me say it again. C-10 imposes regulatory burdens and the obligation to contribute to Canada's creators only on the undertakings, such as the big streaming and sharing platforms, not on individual creators. I'll put it another way. Programs consist of audio and audiovisual content, TV shows, songs, podcasts, postings, and that programming, all those programs exist beyond regulation and will remain beyond regulation. Individuals who create content, amateur or professional, audiences, large or small, are not affected by Bill C-10 when they upload their programming, share it, or even sell it to a streaming service. No one is going to police that content, tell them what they can say, or compel them to pay dues. What Bill C-10 does require, and from my perspective, thank goodness we're finally taking this step, is that the undertaking, the YouTubes, Disney Pluses, Netflixes of the world, who share that content, make money from distributing content, must operate by a set of rules and contribute some amount of the revenues they're harvesting from Canadians to the production of Canadian content. Finally, to those who argue that Bill C-10 fails to protect user-generated content, we say that's just wrong. Clause 2.1 specifically provides that exemption already. New amendments tabled make this exclusion even clearer. So to persist in creating this illusory scare against freedom of expression is either to misunderstand the legislation, in my view, or to intentionally seek to mislead people for some other purpose. I'll finish by saying this. Legislation, of course, is complex, and broadcasting policy and its regulation can be very technical. Devils do lurk in details, and that's why the scrutiny of this committee is so important. But what's at stake here isn't hard to understand. We need to make provision for the reality of these immense and hugely powerful online platforms. We need to ensure that they give, not just take, from Canadian creators and Canadian audiences. And we need to update a broadcasting framework that was last amended before the world was even online. We need what is set out in Bill C-10 with all its provisions and all its protections. And we urge the government to pass this legislation as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Geist, 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As you know, my name is Michael Geist. I appear in a personal capacity representing only my own views. I always start with that statement, but it feels particularly necessary in this instance, given the misinformation and conspiracy theories that some have floated and that Minister Guilbeault disappointingly retweeted. As I'm sure you're aware, I've been quite critical of Bill C-10. I'd like to reiterate that criticism of the bill is not criticism of public support for culture, nor of regulation of technology companies. I think public support for culture is needed, and I think that there are ways to ensure money for creator programs this year, not in 5 years like in this bill. Further, I'm puzzled and discouraged by the lack of interest in Bill C-11, which would move towards modernizing Canada's privacy rules to help address concerns about how these companies collect and use our data. The bill would also mandate algorithmic transparency, which is much needed and far different from government-mandated algorithmic outcomes. I'll confine my opening remarks to the charter-related questions and widespread concern about the regulation of user-generated content, but would welcome questions on any aspect of the bill. There is simply no debating that by removing Section 4.1, the bill now applies to user-generated content, since all audiovisual content is treated as a program under the Act. You've heard experts say that and department officials say that. The attempts to deflect from that simple reality by pointing to Section 2.1 to argue that users are not regulated is deceptive and does not speak to the issue of regulating the content of users. I'll speak to freedom of expression implications in a moment, but want to pause to note that no one, literally no other country, uses broadcast regulation to regulate user-generated content in this way. There's good reasons that all other countries reject this approach. It's not that they don't love their creators or that they want to avoid regulating internet companies. It's that regulating user-generated content in this manner is entirely unworkable, a risk to net neutrality, and a threat to freedom of expression. For example, the European Union, which isn't shy about regulation, distinguishes between streaming services such as Netflix and video sharing services such as TikTok or YouTube, with no equivalent regulations such as those found in C10 for user-generated content. From a charter perspective, the statement issued by Justice last week simply does not contain analysis or discussion about how the regulation of user-generated content as a program intersects with the charter. There is similarly no discussion about whether this might constitute a violation that could be justified, no discussion on the implications of deprioritizing speech, no discussion on the use of terms such as social media service that aren't even defined in the bill, and no discussion of the implementation issues that could require Canadians to disclose personal location-based information in order to comply with new ill-defined requirements. In my view, the prioritization or deprioritization of speech by the government through the CRTC necessarily implicates freedom of expression. The charter statement should have acknowledged this reality and grappled with the question of whether it is saved by Section 1. I don't believe it is. First, the bill is drafted with Section 4.1. In it was the attempt to minimally impair those speech rights. With it removed, the bill no longer does so. Second, the discoverability policy objective is not enough to save the impairment of free speech rights. There is no evidence that there is a discoverability problem with user-generated content. Ms. Yale's panel, which notably appears to have lost its unanimity, recommended discoverability but cited no relevant evidence to support claims there is an issue with user-generated content. Third, the objective of making YouTube pay some additional amount to support music creation isn't enough to save the impairment of free speech rights either. It isn't about compensation because the work's already licensed. This is about paying some additional fees given concerns that Section 4.1 would have broadly exempted YouTube. I'm not convinced that was the case, as services such as YouTube Music Premium might well have been captured. And I'm not alone on that. Canadian heritage officials thought so too in a memo they wrote to the minister. In fact, it was such a non-issue that Mr. Cash's organization did not even specifically cite the provision or raise the issue in the brief it submitted to this committee. I find it remarkable that the minister and the charter statement effectively tell Canadians they should trust the CRTC to appropriately address free speech rights, but are unwilling to do so with respect to how Section 4.1 would be interpreted. Let me conclude by noting that if a choice must be made, some additional payments by a streaming service or regulating the free speech rights of Canadians, I would have thought that standing behind freedom of expression would be an easy choice to make, and I've been genuinely shaken to find that my government thinks otherwise. I look forward to your questions.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, sir.
Chancin.
In the next 5 minutes, Mr. Trudel, please. Mr. Chair, Mr. Miller, members of the Canadian Heritage Committee, I am a law professor. I have been teaching since 1979 on broadcasting legislation. I was research director of the committee that gave birth to an earlier Broadcasting Act, and as Ms. Yale highlighted, I was part of the panel on the revision of the Act. As noted in the Department of Justice Charter Statement, Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act, modifies an act that even before C-10 came to life, did not authorize taking measures against individuals with respect to the content they decide to put online. Above all, the bill already very clearly sets out that all measures put in place to regulate the broadcasting of programs must respect freedom of expression. Moreover, the Broadcasting Act has never authorized the CRTC to censor specific content. The CRTC's entire practice over the past 50 years bears witness to this. What is more still, the Broadcasting Act requires that the CRTC abstain from regulating in any way that violates freedom of expression. I find it harder to imagine a more general exclusion than that one. This is an exclusion that is in the form of an interdiction that forbids the CRTC to regulate in a manner that would violate freedom of expression. And the Act, as you know, sets out that the CRTC must refrain from regulating any activity that does not have a demonstrable impact on the achievement of Canadian broadcasting policy. In fact, the Broadcasting Act is an empowering act. In that act, details are nowhere to be found that would empower the CRTC that it empowers the CRTC to establish rules tailored to the circumstances of each type of undertaking to ensure that they in turn will organize their activities to contribute to achieving the broadcasting policy objectives in Section 3 of the Act. Therefore, there is no need for Bill C-10 to multiply the exclusions for one type of content or another. There are already exclusions for measures that would risk freedom of expression. The Broadcasting Act targets all undertakings that transmit programming, including online. And when it comes to online undertakings that determine what content is suggested to individuals by using algorithms or artificial intelligence, Bill C-10 strengthens the fundamental rights of all Canadians. It empowers the CRTC to require undertakings to provide information about the logic behind such mechanisms. And until now, that has not yet existed. The bill allows the CRTC to put measures in place to ensure that Canadians will be shown a choice of programming that reflects the principles, values, and objectives set out in Section 3 of the Broadcasting Act. There is nothing in this bill that would allow the CRTC to impose on anyone any programming that the person does not wish to hear or see, let alone allow the CRTC to censor content on platforms. Rather, the bill ensures that individuals have a real freedom to choose. Currently, there is nothing to guarantee that online undertakings provide Canadians with real choice that reflects Canadian values as enshrined in the Broadcasting Act. From the early years of radio, there has been tension, and this tension is between those who believe that broadcasting undertakings should be left to market forces alone and those who, in my opinion, rightly feel that intervention is required to ensure a true availability of programming that is product of Canadian creativity. Bill C-10 is part of this line of legislation, a continuum that has provided Canadians with media that gives them the best the world has to offer while saving a meaningful place for the work of Canadian creators. In particular, those that come from minority or Indigenous or First Nations communities. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Trudel.
Thank you, Mr. Trudel.
Okay. Mr. Cash, 5 minutes, please.
Well, Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, fellow panelists, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Cash. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Independent Music Association, and it is a pleasure to be back at committee and speaking to you
Mr.
today.
Cash, Mr. Cash, sorry, I hate to interrupt you. I'm loath to interrupt you, even when you just started, but there is some popping on your microphone. Do you want to pull
How's that?
you may want to pull it up a little bit more. You went from
that way.
There you go.
How's that? That's better.
That sounds much better. Thank you. So sorry for the interruption. Carry on, sir. I'll give you back your full 5.
Well, you get the gist. I'm just saying hello. Let's start by getting one thing off the table. Digital platforms like Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, they're incredible. And they represent phenomenal opportunities for Canadian arts and culture creators. You know, it's been said that being in the music business is a great way to get rich and a lousy way to make a living. The pandemic has put this maxim in stark focus. Many artists and musicians lived below the poverty line before the pandemic, but the pandemic has made things much, much worse. Travel and gathering restrictions have meant no touring, no live shows, no income at all. But the pandemic has also underlined the systemic inequities in the market that have led to diminished compensation for creators. This imbalance has put the promise of a stable middle-class sector of artists and arts and culture workers further and further out of reach for this country. The sector is in crisis. CIMA commissioned Nordicity to do a report on the impact of COVID. It found that the independent music sector saw a drop in revenue of $233 million. Live music saw a drop in income of 79%. Independent sound recording and publishing companies saw a 41% decline in revenue, and thousands of jobs were lost. And that's just in the first 9 months of the pandemic. We don't expect to return to pre-COVID levels of revenue until 2023-24 at best. But as we move towards recovery, we must address the elephant in the room. That digital giants doing business in Canada make lots of money off Canadians, but pay fractions of a cent to content creators, and they operate here without any accountability or regulatory obligations, including to fairly contribute to the arts and culture ecosystem. Are we okay with this? Given the numbers that I've laid out before you today, if there ever was a time when we needed you to stand up for the little guy, it's right now. I mean, do you really want to go back to your ridings and, say to your constituents, yes, I voted to protect big tech. I voted to allow them to continue raking in the profits, taking those profits out of the country and not contributing a dime in return. Now, unless things have dramatically changed since I was an elected politician, I don't think you want to be doing that. In fact, many of you from all parties have pointed out that this inequitable playing field is wrong, and we've got to do something about it. CanCon regulations were created 50 years ago and helped establish a domestic industry within a domestic market. We wanted to protect and nurture French language creators who were surrounded on all sides by English language cultural content and English language creators who were competing on all sides with the massive giant next door. Well, today, our arts and culture marketplace is no longer a domestic one. Digital platforms have transformed the way content is consumed, and today, the marketplace is global. Today, we need a modernized system to grow our domestic industry into one that will thrive in the global market. This bill, flawed though it is, could point us toward new modes of discoverability, new investments in our artists and our arts and culture entrepreneurs, and towards information transparency and accountability from big tech companies that simply doesn't exist right now. CIMA believes that the bill, as amended, did not infringe on individuals' rights and freedoms. That belief was affirmed by last week's charter statement and further proposed amendments. But let's be clear, we would oppose any measure that put those rights at risk. Artists have long been at the forefront of fighting for civil liberties and freedom of expression against monolithic power structures. Our work quite literally depends on civil liberty and the protected freedom of expression. C10 isn't touch your cat videos. What it could do, though, is begin to make a real difference in the lives of musicians, content creators, entrepreneurs, and art and culture across the country. It has the potential to move the creative sector from precarity towards middle-class stability, unlocking innovation, and creating a global presence for the sector. And so I implore you today to continue your work in amending Bill C-10 as expediently as possible in order to pass it through Parliament before the end of the spring session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cash. Okay, that concludes just a couple housekeeping items, folks. Dr. Geist, we had some popping on your microphone as well. If you want to put that microphone between your nose and your mouth, just look towards yourself in the camera. Yep, that's it. You got it right there. Just one other thing. Also, I want to welcome Mr. Manley. Mr. Manley from the Green Party is here with us today. Now, just so that if you're watching from afar, yes, we have 4 parties that are permanent members that are represented on this committee. Mr. Manley is from the Green Party. However, the rules state that the Green Party, not an officially recognized party, but they can take part by asking questions, getting involved in debate, or proposing amendments. They can't vote on them, and they can't move motions of that nature, but they can participate. That being said, Mr. Manley, and I'm sure my committee will agree, has been quite active thus far on amendments. And for that reason, I, as part of the chair's discretion, Mr. Manley, I'm going to put you in as number 5 on the first round. I'm going to give you between 3 and 5 minutes. I'll give you a rough number. And then after that, I'm afraid you'll have to turn to some of your colleagues to get more time than that. But I'll put it at the end of the first round. So we go from Ms. McPherson to you, and I'll give you between 3 and 5 minutes on that round. Okay, that being said, off we go, folks. Now, to start with, I have 2 names, Ms. Harder and Mr. Waugh. Now, do you want to share 3 minutes each? Or Ms. Harder, would you like to start and then throw it to Mr. Waugh when you're ready? I'll go for the latter. Ms. Harder, you have 6 minutes at your discretion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chair. My question is for Dr. Geist, and it is this. Both Ms. Yale and the minister, and actually all the other witnesses on this panel, I guess, today, have tried to make the claim that our freedom of speech is not being attacked by this bill. In fact, that it's not even impacted. That somehow content can be moved up or down in the queue without impacting other content. Now, it would be my opinion or my observation that in order for some information to be bumped up and made more discoverable, other information then must be bumped down. I just don't see how it's possible to not have that be the case. So when that is the case, then it means that there's a mechanism being used in order to regulate and curate what I can and cannot see, which then would be a form of censorship. Mr. Geist, I'm wondering if you can comment or elaborate on this further.
Well, I think you've highlighted what is the nub for so many experts that have spoken out on this issue. And that is that, first off, let's be clear, user-generated content, when we are speaking of the content, is regulated. I mean, it's absurd to simply suggest, well, you're exempted or the CRTC is bound by some other policy objectives. We are putting it into the basket of regulation. And we would never dream of saying the CRTC would or should regulate things like our own letters or our blog posts, but this is core expression for millions of Canadians, and we are saying that it is treated as a program like any other, subject to regulation. That's number one. When you layer in on top of that, as the Liberal proposed amendment does, discoverability requirements, what you are saying is that the government, through its regulator, gets to determine what gets prioritized, not on a specific piece of content per se, but it's going to make choices, elevating some, deprioritizing others. That clearly has an impact on individual Canadians' expressive rights. It's doing so in an environment that frankly is completely unworkable when you think about this from a user-generated content perspective. And the notion that somehow this increases choice at a time when there is unlimited choice for user-generated content is frankly just absurd.
Thank you. I'll give the rest of my time to Kevin Waugh.
Well, thank you. I'm going to continue with Dr. Geist if I can, because I was at the original news conference of the Yale report, and the chair talked about leveling the playing field. And we've often heard for the last several months, level the playing field. You say that's not the case. Maybe just talk about that, because level the playing field is an expression that this government has used since they introduced this bill in November.
They do. And Ms. Yale often talks about like for like, as if we need to treat all these players in the same fashion. What we ought to recognize is that the existing broadcast sector enjoys a whole series of regulatory advantages worth hundreds of millions of dollars that are not available to streaming services. It's things like simultaneous substitution, where they
La substitution simultanée quand on substitue.
Worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the must carry rule, so that you have to carry certain channels, which is otherwise unavailable. It's foreign investment restrictions or foreign ownership restrictions that are there. There are a whole series of measures that actually don't make this like for like. Now, listen, that's not to suggest that there ought not to be a regulatory environment for online undertakings. What I would say, though, is that trying to treat them in the same fashion as this bill does has rendered it fundamentally flawed. And this committee ought to know it better than anyone, because they've had witness after witness say they're concerned about things like changing Canadian ownership requirements, changing the performers, prioritization, changing Canadian intellectual property. And all of that is a function of trying to treat online in precisely the same fashion as conventional broadcasters.
You have been pretty vocal on Twitter and other social media about this. You've said, scrap this bill, start over. Others on this committee want this bill to proceed. It's been 30 plus years now since we've updated the Broadcasting Act. We all realize this act has to be modified at some point. Maybe just talk about scrapping it and what would put in there instead of what we have in front of us today.
Sure. So I would start by noting that, I think we've seen the flaws. I mean, Mr. Cash even acknowledged that it's a flawed piece of legislation. And we now have the government contradicting its own department officials again and again on things that were directly included in government memos from the Heritage Department to the minister with advice on some of these issues. And so it's a flawed piece of legislation. The concerns are real and legitimate, raised by an incredible number of people, including people who have been some of the biggest critics of tech companies in the country. And so I would suggest that I think we need to get this right, because we don't change our legislation that frequently. Clearly, it runs sometimes for decades. But at the same time, we need to ensure that there is money for creators for precisely the kinds of reasons that Mr. Cash identified. And so what I would say is the starting point is tax dollars. The government's already announced that it wants to increase the taxes on tech companies. It should take some of that tax money, allocate it directly to the various creator programs. And in doing so, there could be money this year at the time when there really is that need for money, as opposed to the way this will play out with this bill, which is undoubtedly going to take years before the CRTC and in litigation that is inevitable to ensue, so that nobody is going to see a dime coming out of this legislation for years. There's a mechanism both to get the legislation right and to ensure that creators get money, and to do so quickly.
Okay, I must have a few seconds left, and there is an open letter I see to the Prime Minister. Mr. Chair, do I still have 30 seconds left, or am I done?
I'll let you ask your question very quickly.
Okay, there is an open letter, Canadian Internet Policy and Technical Professionals, that put it out, Future of Free and Open Internet. Just comment on that, because it's a letter sent to the Prime Minister today.
It is, and I'm proud to have signed that letter. I think one of the most shameful aspects of this debate over the last few weeks has been the continual attempt to suggest that somehow it's just people who are speaking on behalf of tech companies, or are critical or don't want to see any internet regulation, who are concerned with Bill C-10. That letter has been signed by some of the fiercest critics and biggest experts around tech policy: Ron Deberts, Bianca Wiley's, Nazma Ahmed, Lex Gill, people who the Canadians have learned to trust, who have expressed real concerns about the tech companies. They've looked at Bill C-10, they've looked at government policy around the internet, and said they're very concerned about the path we're headed in.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Appreciate that. Now, folks, one thing I want to point out, and that is, in a normal setting when we're all together, sometimes our witnesses would like to be recognized for something to say. I noticed Ms. Yale has her hand up virtually, and she wishes to discuss that. However, I have to say that when we give our colleagues, when we give the member of the committee the full 6 minutes, it is theirs alone. I only ask that colleagues be cognizant of someone may have their hand up or not. You don't have to go to that person, but just know that they will be recognized. Once that colleague stops asking questions, we're going to lower the hands and then we'll start again. So that being said, we now go to Ms. DeBruzen for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in fact, I had noticed that Janet Yale had her hand up and seemed to want to respond to some of the pieces, some of the aspects that were touched upon by Dr. Geist on discoverability and the like. So perhaps if we could start there with your ability to respond.
Thank you very much. I want to make just 2 or 3 quick points. The first is that programs aren't regulated, undertakings are. So when Dr. Geist says if it's a program, it's regulated, it's not a program unless it's offered by an undertaking. Online undertakings are the only ones that are subject to regulation, not people who make programs. It's really that clear. So point number 1, a program isn't regulated, only an undertaking is, whether it's a streaming platform or a social media platform. Secondly, on discoverability, the way Dr. Geist describes it would have you think that the algorithms that are operated by the likes of Amazon and Netflix are just mathematically pure, uncontaminated by commercial considerations, and that everything you see is driven completely in an agnostic way by consumer preferences. Well, I can tell you personally, anybody that when I've bought things on Amazon or I've chosen a show on Netflix, before I know it, I have pushed to me all kinds of things that have nothing to do with my preferences or taste, but everything to do with the things that the provider in question is trying to push. So it's not to say that once we acknowledge that algorithms are not agnostic, then it's really a question of, does cultural policy have a role to play in ensuring that in a world of so many choices, unlimited amounts of content, that we should know what Canadian choices might be available? That's just the simple principle of discoverability. And it's not about interfering with freedom of choice. It's about promotion of Canadian choices. Nobody has to watch it if they don't want to watch it. So there is actually no restrictions on freedom of choice whatsoever. So those would be my thoughts, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have.
Sure, thanks. Je voulais aussi
I also wanted to give a little time to Professor Trudel. I don't know if you might have something that you would like to say to respond to Dr. Geist.
Je pense que ce qu'il faut partir.
I think that what is essential to understand in this situation is that algorithms used to direct traffic towards internet content are not neutral. That is regulation by default. Those are rules by default. And currently, there is absolutely nothing that guarantees that this regulation by default, which comes purely from commercial priorities, will not be full of bias or possibly violate freedom of expression. So if we want to talk about intentions, we need to take that into account too. Currently, there is absolutely no guarantee for Canadians that their choices will not be biased and directed in just as much an anti-democratic way as it could potentially be if the multiple possibilities or scenarios that have been discussed came to be. That is to say that if the CRTC one day decided to violate freedom of speech, to go against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our rights and freedoms would be violated. But that is extremely hypothetical. And currently, today, companies and undertakings practices monopolize online platforms. And these undertakings, with absolute impunity and with no transparency, are infringing on our rights and freedoms, our fundamental rights. And that is exactly how C10 is helpful and strengthens our fundamental rights. And on the internet currently, there is no protection for our rights. Our rights to access content that reflects us, our rights to not be spied on when we make a choice, those rights are not guaranteed currently. And government regulation can help. Thank you.
I have a minute if I can go back to Janet Yale, please. Just because there's been some conversation about how much consultation went into preparing for this bill, but if you could just quickly talk about the number of consultation stakeholders that you spoke with in preparing your report, which formed the backdrop to preparing C10.
Thank you for that question. In fact, we went to great lengths to go coast to coast to coast to meet with people. We reached out proactively, made it clear that we were ready, willing, and able to meet with anyone, any stakeholders, minority language groups, Indigenous communities, all the different stakeholders from all sides of the debate. And we, in fact, spent about 6 months just doing consultations to make sure that we heard how the organizations, how the stakeholders, how consumer groups were feeling challenged about the current environment and their recommendations for how we should go forward. So we didn't start deliberating until after both written and oral consultations that took us, I would say, from August till January of 2018 through to early 2019 when we began our deliberations in earnest.
Thank you, Ms. Yeo. Monsieur Champoux.
Mr. Champoux, for 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would also like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. It's very much appreciated. We were much looking forward to it. I would like to start with Mr. Trudel. A few moments ago, Mr. Trudel, you were talking about how the way things are currently, we are not very protected. Our privacy and our freedom to choose are not very protected. Bill C-10 aims to improve the situation. Do you think it will? I think that C-10, to amend the Broadcasting Act, will ensure that the new Broadcasting Act will further protect Canadian citizens and Canadian consumers' rights. And the authority given to the CRTC to oversee algorithm processes so that the public, and let's remember that the CRTC does not operate behind closed doors. It follows a public process that everyone can access. And in this process, we can expect that the CRTC could invite major platforms to come and explain just how algorithms and other processes that they use to direct traffic towards various content, explain how all of those mechanisms work, and explain to the CRTC how they are compatible with Canadian values and how they are not vulnerable to commercial interests, to give more transparency, to show how they reflect Canadian values, which are different from American values. Values, for example, diversity, and so on. And they could explain, the major players could explain how the algorithms work. For example, or algorithms could be organized in a way that would reflect the values in the Broadcasting Act. For example, it could give more visibility to minority creative programming, including creative content from Indigenous communities and from racialized communities. With a Broadcasting Act, as is proposed in Bill C-10, we would have more a speech act than a censorship act. It would lead undertakings to be promoters, and consumers would still be free to consume what they wish. No one will be forced to watch what they do not want to watch. We often have a difficult time finding Canadian culture reflective programming online, or programming that reflects the reality of linguistic minority or cultural minority groups in Canada. That is what is currently missing on those platforms. And that's why in Canada it has been possible to create a very open platform for media that brings in the best programming from the rest of the world that works very well. And in addition, we have access to programming created by Canadians. So I believe this is a bill that strengthens our rights. I'll interrupt you, Mr. Trudel. I would really like to come back to what you were just mentioning. I'd like to come back to censorship. Today, we're bringing you and the witness panel in because we want to continue the important work on Bill C-10. So the withdrawal of 4.1 gave way to concerns by certain people, certain groups, but there are other amendments upcoming. One has not proven sufficient to convince people about liberty of expression, but let's imagine a scenario where the CRTC were to take a decision that violates freedom of expression. Could that happen? In what context? And what would happen afterwards to remedy the problem? Because I think there are mechanisms in place. Yes, absolutely. First of all, if the CRTC ever did make that decision, this would happen in the context of a public process. All Canadians would be invited to provide their point of view on what actions the CRTC should take, and then the CRTC would take those measures, either by issuing an order or a regulation. And this would fall under provisions that are already in the Broadcasting Act. Thank you. I think this is a very far-fetched hypothesis. It is unthinkable. For that to happen, the CRTC would have to... Thank you, Mr. Trudel. Thank you, Mr. Trudel.
I truly appreciate your enthusiasm. You have no idea after being in this committee for a long time. But I have to leave it at that, as in we also have to follow the clock here. Nevertheless, we now go to Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Speaker, I just would like to raise a point of order.
One moment. Ms. Harder for point of order.
Sure, thank you. Mr. Chair, just looking for clarification. I understand that you've given the Green member some time to ask questions. It's my understanding that that's permitted only if another member who is a permanent member on this committee agrees to share their time.
Actually, Ms. Harder, under normal circumstances, I've done that, yes. but I've also seen precedents where we've allowed discretion for other members to involve. I have not given Mr. Manley any time thus far in C10 deliberations. However, he's been very active proposing amendments, and I thought it would only be at chair's discretion to say, yes, go ahead. He's only getting the one question, certainly no more than 5 minutes. And there is precedence for that, Ms. Harder. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. McPherson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for joining us today. Obviously, our goal here is to create broadcasting legislation that does protect Canadians' freedom of expression and also levels the playing field, and in fact makes the web giants contribute to our broadcasting landscape. So I appreciate that you've all come here to share your expertise, because I think we're all trying to get to a place where we can work collaboratively, we can hear from experts, we can get the best information possible, and we can create the best legislation going forward. I know we all recognize that the legislation before us needs some work. It needs some attention. And so I thank you for being with us here today and helping us make this bill or make future legislation as good as it possibly can be for our broadcasters and for our artists and our creative sector. I'm going to start by asking a few questions of Mr. Cash, if I could. Mr. Cash, you spoke about the impact and the importance of the independent music industry for our local culture and our economic development. Could you speak a little bit more about that, please?
Thank you so much for the question. Roughly 80% of all the players in the music scene, in the music sector writ large in Canada are solo self-employed or solo operators. They are running, in a sense, small businesses, and there are some larger entities, of course, but that's the reality, and their combined efforts and their combined risk, and which, by the way, there is a lot of risk, not just on one's financial resources, but also on your physical and mental health to be in this business. There is a real need for people like you to really understand what we're doing and how we do it. People don't really know how the music that they're listening to in their earbuds, how it got there, how it was made, and who made it. And this is one of the reasons why a bill like C10 is so important, because, as I said in my opening remarks, COVID really has laid bare the vulnerabilities in the system, and it would be one thing if this was pre-internet, but the fact of the matter is that these massive companies are interacting with our arts and culture sector. They essentially need the content, and not just Canadian content, but the content of all creators around the world. They need it in order to make their platforms roll. And too often, it is especially the artists and the small independent Canadian-owned companies that get swept under. One other thing that's important to note here when you're asking about the Canadian independent music scene is that we're talking about Canadian-owned companies. We're not talking about multinational entities. We're talking about people that live and work in your communities, that are developing intellectual property, that are trying to and many times are successfully exporting that to markets beyond our borders and bringing that revenue back to Canada. We look at C10 as a way of really improving that and adding to that.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Well, and I think, I mean, one of the concerns that's come up as we talk about C10, of course, is the need for freedom of expression to be protected. Of course, this is something that you will know the NDP have pushed for a very long time, and I think probably artists more than any other group of people would defend freedom of expression because, of course, it's at the heart of their reason for being. Could you tell us more about the economic reality of artists in your industry and why they want web giants to pay their fair share, while fully, of course, respecting the freedom of expression and the ability of people to publish content of their choice on the internet?
Well, right now, the way the internet sector is working for music is few companies, few artists have any leverage in negotiating with YouTube. The music's generally up already, and so the choice is between licensing and getting a lousy return on that, or getting no money at all. Yeah, so that is really a stark choice for entrepreneurs, absolutely. But for the artists themselves, this presents a huge problem. And I'm not going to say that it's all terrible news for artists, because as I said right off the top, these platforms represent enormous opportunity. But we have to get it right, and part of getting it right is bringing these massive, the biggest companies in the history of time, we need to bring them under some kind of regulatory system where they can be accountable to the people of Canada.
And contributing to our artistic
100%,
sector, of course.
100%.
Yeah, well, I mean, you probably know, but Edmonton Strathcona has an enormous number of artists, and I can't wait until we can have live shows again and we can see some of our artists. So thank you very much for what you've done to encourage artists, and thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Chair, I believe that is my time. Is that correct?
Pretty close enough, we'll say. You have just enough time to say hello.
Hello.
Done. Okay, Mr. Manley, I'll say up to 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the witnesses for appearing today. This is a very interesting debate on a very important bill, and I've worked in the broadcast industry in multiple different ways and was a professional musician as well, so this is very near and dear to me. I want to ask Mr. Trudell to start. Did you approve of the removal of 4.1? And then I'd like to ask you about net neutrality and how the algorithms affect the concept of net neutrality in terms of the Canadian law on net neutrality. I understand the concepts of throttling, but how do the algorithms affect the law on net neutrality? Go ahead, sorry. Alors, oui, moi j'étais de ceux qui...
Yes, I was one of the ones who always thought that Section 4.1 was not helpful. It was a source of confusion. And why? Because the bill already had everything necessary to ensure that the Canadian broadcasting system operated without violating freedom of expression. In addition, the CRTC is also required to limit its actions only to undertakings whose activities have a demonstrable impact on broadcasting policy in Canada. As a result, 4.1 was rightly removed because it was not useful, and I wrote it in an article in Le Devoir. So algorithms currently, clearly, no matter how they work, do limit or do determine the type of content that will be more visible than other types of content. That is a fundamental characteristic of broadcasting policy in every country, whether we're talking about traditional or online broadcasting. That is to say that Legislative measures strike a balance between commercial interests of undertakings and other interests that must be accommodated. In traditional broadcasting, this took the form of rules that limit commercial activities of TV stations and radio stations, TV channels and radio stations. When it comes to online broadcasting undertakings, we can expect for the CRTC to develop new ways to strike a balance between commercial interests and other objectives that the broadcasting policy has always wanted to prioritize. Throughout Canadian broadcasting history, what distinguishes Canada from many other countries in the world is that we have a communications system that is not just a simple conduit to transmit purely commercial business products.
Take a moment to ask Mr. Geist the same question about the concept of net neutrality and how algorithms work and whether they're just feeding us commercial content and how this is going to be different by having Canadian content rules and discoverability as part of that algorithm, and whether how these things affect net neutrality and the law on net neutrality.
Right, I appreciate the question. First off, for those that aren't aware, net neutrality speaks to the need to treat all content in an equal fashion, regardless of source or destination. And so that's been a core principle, I thought, of successive governments, although it seemed like the Heritage Minister expressed some doubt in at least one media interview around that issue. Quite frankly, we just heard from Professor Trudell. He said that algorithms determine the type of content that is visible. That speaks exactly to the concerns around net neutrality. The notion that an algorithm can, in fact, undermine those net neutrality principles. Now, if it is being done at the behest of a government, which is precisely what is being proposed under this bill, it will be the CRTC that will be making those determinations. That's where the speech implications and the concerns from a net neutrality perspective arise. And that is, again, I repeat, precisely why there is no country in the world that does this. Nobody thinks it is appropriate to have a government make these kinds of choices about what gets prioritized or not prioritized with respect to content. Algorithmic transparency that Professor Trudell mentioned is something entirely separate, and in fact is something that is absolutely necessary from a regulatory perspective, and is even included in Bill C-11 that the government, for whatever reason, has largely buried and hasn't moved forward. So it's not about whether we regulate algorithms, it's about whether the CRTC and the government uses those algorithms to determine or prioritize or deprioritize what we can see.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Now move on to our second round, everybody. Monsieur Reyes.
Mr. Reyes, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to ask quite a direct question to Mr. Trudell. I would like a short answer. You have often said that the CRTC is a good regulator and would not violate freedom of expression. But this morning, you had a publication in Le Devoir. So, Timothy Denton, who was part of the CRTC before, other CRTC members, Peter Menzies, among others, Philip Palmer. These are all experts who have a completely different opinion from your opinion on the current Bill C-10. Is it possible for other experts to have opinions contrary to your own that are still good arguments? Don't they have credibility too? Look, I'm not going to speak about people's credibility. However, what I have noticed is that the CRTC is under the control of legislation, and their decisions have been confirmed by tribunals. some people who say the CRTC is a censorship office can look at the decision regarding a 2004 Quebec radio station where the court decided that the CRTC had properly enforced the rules and had not violated freedom of expression. Mr. Trudel, I just wanted to point out that you often corroborate your arguments using the CRTC, but there are people who used to work at the CRTC who are saying, whoa, this bill doesn't work. And I'm just going to quickly finish my comment. I only have 5 minutes and I will ask you another question. But I just want to point out that everyone has a right to express their opinion on this matter. I'd like to ask Mr. Geist now to explain what is the difference between 2.1 and 4.1, because the minister keeps telling us that there's 2.1, everything is protected, user-generated content will not be threatened. And at the same time, Mr. Trudel has talked about a source of confusion regarding 4.1. Could you give us your vision as a professor of law and a fervent defender of freedom of expression?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I find it quite remarkable. We get some witnesses saying it doesn't mean anything at all. We get others saying that it should be removed. So presumably there was a problem with it. Here's the bottom line reality. As I see it, as many other experts see it, and as the department saw it, including in comments directly to this committee and in memos written to the Heritage Minister now available under the Access to Information Act. Number one, 2.1 speaks, as we've heard, directly to regulating online undertakings. And it is true that we are not going to treat 1 million TikTok users as equivalent to CTV or other broadcasters so that they don't have to appear before the CRTC, which makes a whole lot of sense. They are not broadcasters. There's been some concern even around that because, of course, we had the Heritage Minister talk about the number of viewers or followers that you have that might pull you into that scope. And we've had some creator groups that have suggested that that ought to be the standard that is used, but it doesn't appear to me that that's what 2.1 would do. What 4.1 sought to do was ensure that the programs themselves, the content, would not be treated as something subject potentially to regulation by the CRTC. There was not significant confusion. There was, to be sure, any number of different online services that would have to go before the CRTC to determine whether or not the content on their service was captured by this. That would include some of the YouTube services, but it is certainly was within the realm of possibility that those would be captured. If we are such big fans of the CRTC to get it right, I would have thought that we would have confidence that we could both safeguard and protect user-generated content and that critical form of expression, and have that confidence in the CRTC to get it right in terms of determining where the application of the law might lie.
Merci, Mr. Geist.
Thank you, Mr. Geist. One last very quick question. Is it possible to be for net neutrality? As Mr. Guilbeault said, as Ms. Joly said, as Mr. Lametti said many times, and agree with the amended bill as it is currently. Can someone be for both at the same time?
I don't believe that the bill as currently drafted, much less some of the plans that we know the government has talked about with respect to website blocking, are consistent with net neutrality. And we should be clear, Canada has been looked to as a leader in this space, as a leading voice on net neutrality. It even has sometimes sought to distinguish itself from the United States and others where they've taken a step back from net neutrality. To pass this legislation to give the government the right to prioritize or deprioritize speech severely undermines essentially our credibility as a voice for net neutrality.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Thank you very much. Okay, now we move on. Ms. Ian. Now, folks, before we go to Ms. Ian, just so that I did mention a bio break earlier. Do we still want one? Are we still okay with? We'll do one very shortly. After Ms. Ian, we'll have a very short bio break. Ms. Ian.
Mr. Chair, thank you so very much. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us today in what has been an excellent discussion. I'd like to go to Ms. Yale first. And Ms. Yale, I want to pick up on net neutrality because we've been hearing a lot about that for the past several minutes. Does this bill risk net neutrality? As pointed out, Canada has been a leader with regards to it.
Well, thank you for the question. Obviously, from my perspective, it does not risk compromising net neutrality. Net neutrality has to do with the ability of primarily telecommunications carriers, as in their carriage function, to ensure that they don't advantage or disadvantage particular content. So if you think about online internet services that are offered over if you're a Bell customer or a Rogers customer, you have to make sure that your online subscription to Disney isn't better service than your online subscription to Crave or your online subscription to a different streaming service. The principle of net neutrality is that carriers should be agnostic and about the way in which they make sure that content starts in point A, gets delivered to point B without interference, without throttling, without blocking. And in our report, we were very clear that the principle of net neutrality is fundamental. It's quite a different thing to talk about cultural policy objectives, as my colleague, Mr. Trudel, described. If we believe in cultural policy, we make choices, whether it's on traditional broadcasters having obligations about what shows you watch at what time of day, whether it's cable companies having carriage requirements. The fact that these are now distributed on the internet doesn't change the fundamental question as to whether or not, for our values, for cultural policy purposes, should there be requirements so that in a world, as we say in our report, of fantastic choices and borderless access to content, whether Canadians should be aware of the choices that are available to them that are Canadian. I don't see that as in any way in conflict with the principle of net neutrality. It really is a completely separate subject in my view.
Thank you, Ms. Yale. And another question for you. Dr. Geist has said with the removal of 4.1, the bill now threatens user-generated content, and to that end, freedom of speech. In your expert opinion, what would you say to those citizens, Canadian citizens, who are concerned about that?
Well, first, I would say that there is nothing in the bill as amended with the exclusion of 4.1 that threatens free speech. I've tried to make it clear in my comments thus far in this meeting that users put content, say on a social media platform. For sure, that content may be under the legal definition of a program. But I've said before, programs aren't regulated. So if you're a like a blogger or someone who makes podcasts, those are podcasts, that's content for sure. But how is it distributed? It's distributed because you do an arrangement with Spotify or you do an arrangement with YouTube, and it's carried on those platforms. The platforms are the online undertakings that would be regulated, not the creators of the content, whether they're users, whether they're amateurs, whether they're professionals. You are free to put up anything you want, whether you monetize it or not, whether you get advertising or subscription revenues or not. It's not covered by Bill C-10. It's the online undertakings, and users are not operating online undertakings. They're not regulated. So in my view, there's no threat to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the ability to put out anything you want on any platform you like without fear that your content could be moderated or regulated in any way.
Ms. Yale, thank you. Mr. Chair, how am I doing for time?
You've got 17 seconds, ma'am.
Well, then I will just say thank you. I will say
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for that.
I'm sure a lot of people will thank you because that brings us to our break. Folks, once you come back online, please turn your video on so that I can see that we're ready. But I ask you no more than 5 minutes, please. So let's suspend for 5 minutes. into the next person. That would be Monsieur Champoux.
Mr. Champoux, for 2 minutes, 30 seconds, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to send over a question to Mr. Geist. I see that you have all of the reasons in the world to be opposed to this bill. Is there wording that we could add to this bill around freedom of expression that would reassure you for you to say there's no problem anymore?
Thanks for that. On this specific issue, I don't think there's any doubt, but that we need to put back in Section 4, put the Section 4.1, or exclude all scope of regulation of this kind of content. And so that would include discoverability, which does go without question to, as we've heard even from Professor Trudel, to choices and then ultimately to net neutrality.
Monsieur Trudel, votre opinion?
Mr. Trudel, your opinion on this? Do you think there is any language that we should add? I know that you are not concerned about freedom of expression, but do you think that to reassure those who are concerned, that we should add in wording?
Monsieur Trudel?
Mr. Trudel, the question is for you. Well, look, net neutrality does not have to do with platforms. So in the context of the world, when we're talking about net neutrality, what we're talking about is the tube, is the connection. But when we talk about Google or YouTube and these platforms, net neutrality does not apply to them. They are businesses, they're undertakings. If I am a doctor, I am subject to regulations in medicine. And when we look at broadcasting, the same goes for platforms. So to me, it is logical because net neutrality is a question of whether or not my connection to the content is biased. And Spotify, YouTube, etc. are undertakings that we never thought of when we thought of applying net neutrality. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's all the time I had.
Okay, merci. Ms. McPherson, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, we've been focusing a lot on how C10, the risks that C10 puts forward, I guess, and concerns that people, experts, have raised about the freedom of expression. I just wonder if I could ask one quick question, Mr. Cash, of you, in terms of the potential of C10. So if a C10, a version of C10 is passed that does provide support for our artistic community, could you talk a little bit about the growing international marketplace and how that could impact the sector if C10 was passed?
Well, there's no question that the sector is changing, and it's changing based on a global market, and Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadian artists, and the entire independent music sector could be really poised to play a significant role in our country's post-COVID economic recovery, one that's centered around creating good middle-class green jobs, developing Canadian-owned intellectual property by artists and entrepreneurs that have the know-how and the experience to export at scale to every market on the planet, quite frankly. And the needs of the sector could very much be helped, I think, by this injection of support into the sector that C10 promises. And you know, we need to work quickly to get this through because we have a lot of work to do at the CRTC to make sure this happens.
Thank you. My next question, I'm going to ask some questions. I probably don't have a ton of time, but I'll ask some questions of Mr. Geist if I could. So, Mr. Geist, my colleague, Mr. Shampoo, has just asked, what we could do to make C10 something that you would be able to support. And you speak about taking out that clause 4.1. I guess, could you just, my concern is that we need to find a way to do this broadcasting legislation. We know it's 30 years overdue. What are the things aside from that one? What are the other things that you would like to see us do to ensure that this legislation, does what we've asked it to do in terms of leveling the playing field, in terms of protecting our artistic sector, our broadcasting sector, but also in terms of protecting freedom of expression?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier today, my view is that the legislation is flawed on a number of levels, and so that, frankly, if the goals you just articulated are important ones, my view is, especially on the finance side, the best thing that we can do is make sure that there is money that's made available quickly, and we can do that through things like the digital services tax and other related tax measures. And I think in many ways we have to go back and take a harder look at some of the kinds of approaches that are contained in this bill. I'm struggling a little bit with some of the comments that I've heard today. This notion, for example, on net neutrality, which is a core principle that ought to be protected. We've had now both Ms. Yale and Professor Trudell say, well, there's nothing to do with that. In their own report, it specifically notes that there are other emerging issues that go beyond classical internet access, have much in common with the goals of net neutrality. I don't know if that was written by some of the members who aren't standing anymore with them and have broken away from the BTLR, but nevertheless, it's clear that these are issues we need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. We now go to Mr. Aitchison and Mr. Shields. And again, I have both of you here. Would you like to split that time, or Mr. Aitchison, you want to use your discretion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'd first like to ask if it's possible for us to consider extending the time. This is a really valuable conversation. We have some very intelligent, educated people here, and I think there's lots more questions. So.
Okay, so before I let you start, how about we deal with that as we get closer to the allotted time, which would be 4:30 Eastern, and we'll do, because usually it's implied consent that we shut down at that time. However, if we are in the middle of something, we can extend it a bit. In the meantime, I will seek out if that's possible, because I have to check that as well, given the logistics of the room and so on and so forth, with your blessing, of course. So, Mr. Aitchison, I'm going to go to you, and when you're ready, you can put it over to your colleague, Mr. Shields.
Okay, thank you very much. And that is what I do intend to do. I actually want to focus very specifically on comments that Miss Yale, sorry, I don't know if it's Miss Yale has said, and Dr. Geist. And it's specifically about a comment that you made, Dr. Yale, or not Dr. Geist and Miss Yale. What I'm struggling with is clearly your name, but aside from that, I'm struggling with understanding how if you regulate the online platforms, the mediums, the forums by which individual Canadians create content and share them with the world, how you're not indirectly, if you're regulating the platform itself, how you're not indirectly regulating the content creators themselves. You made the point that you're regulating the platforms, not the content creators, but you are indirectly regulating the content creators, are you not? And I'd like Dr. Geist and Ms. Yale to speak to that, please. And I apologize for butchering your name.
No, it's fine. The name's Yale. It doesn't matter what you call me before that, as long as it's polite. But Michael, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Then you're talking. Go ahead. You can respond.
All right. So, what I've tried to do is to draw that distinction. Maybe I haven't done it clearly, but the later amendments make it clear that the only thing that's going to be regulated with respect to platforms, and let's keep the streaming services aside, because I think the controversy seems to be now more about the social media platforms than the streaming services. Because streaming services, as curators, they purchase, create, the content that they then package and make available to you. So there isn't, if a producer creates a show that is then offered on Netflix, it's not it's generated by a creator, but I don't think we're talking about that in the same way as what we think of on YouTube as user-generated content, where people make things, podcasts, songs, dances, whatever, and then post them to a platform. So they're user-generated. They're not contracted directly by a streaming services. The platforms are available to people to put things on at their discretion. That discretion doesn't change. People can post whatever they want on social media platforms. There's no regulation. And the more recent amendments that Minister Guilbeault spoke to said that there would only be 3 things that could be done vis-a-vis those platforms. Only 3. So there's been a real contraction of the regulation-making power of the CRTC vis-a-vis those platforms. So 3 things: they have to provide information about their revenues, advertising or subscription. Number 2, then those revenues are used to calculate what their levy will be, or their spending requirement, as the case may be. So it's just how much are you making in Canada and what is the appropriate amount to make as a contribution. And then the third piece is what we've been calling discoverability, which is how to make the Canadian creative content visible. That's it. So I have a hard time seeing how that's regulation of the content. It just isn't.
Okay, thanks. We're running out of time though, so I want to go to Dr. Geist, if you don't mind. Thank you for that.
Sure. Thanks for that. Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think you get it exactly right. What we effectively have is now an outsourcing of that regulation to the tech platforms, which actually provides Canadians with even less protection. It's government doing indirectly what it would think it would be difficult to do directly, which is regulate the discoverability of that content. Let's even leave aside the notion of how we would even figure that out. If I do a video with my siblings who live in the United States and in other countries, is that Canadian content? Is that not Canadian content? We have a hard time figuring out what constitutes Canadian content for certified productions. Suddenly now we're going to ask the CRTC to decide which cat video constitutes Canadian content and which one doesn't. And when you ask the government to decide what gets prioritized and what does not, that is absolutely regulation, and deputizing tech platforms to enforce those government edicts in many respects are even worse because they aren't subject to some of the same kinds of restrictions.
Okay, thank you. I have a million more questions, but I think I need to go to Mr. Shields now.
Mr. Shields, you have 10 seconds.
Oh, come on, really? I'm sorry.
One very quick question, Mr. Shields. Otherwise, we are going to go back to the Conservatives after Mr. Lewis.
Quickly then, Michelle, do you back all 97 recommendations that you had in the rail report?
Of course. Of course. And I would note that those 97 recommendations are unanimous recommendations of the entire committee.
And thank you. That would mean that you would back then.
All right. Thank you, Mr.
board.
Shields.
Yep. Thank you.
I was being rather generous with the 10.
Yeah,
but,
I appreciate that.
But after Mr. Lewis, as I mentioned, we are going to go back to conservative slot one more time. It looks like we are going to get into that third round, folks. So we'll judge it accordingly. Mr. Lewis, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I appreciate you all being here for this wonderful discussion. Maybe I'd start with Ms. Yale, because I believe there was a bit of confusion. We talked about concerns for freedom of speech, and you mentioned previously there's nothing in this bill that threatens freedom of speech. We talk about users putting content online, and even if there are podcasts, they're still called programs, that's fine, but they're still carried on those platforms, and it's the platforms that the online undertakings that'll be regulated. So I believe there's a bit of confusion possibly between Canadian artists and Canadian content as far as discoverability. Can you expand on that and maybe clear this up as being an expert that you are?
Well, thank you for the question. I think you've really well characterized the distinction I've been drawing between programs and undertakings. And I think the issue of discoverability is not a new one. It's just that the context of being online and the context of being on social media platforms is a new one, in the sense that what does it mean to promote and create visibility for Canadian content on these platforms. And the way in which we've done it in traditional media is different than the way we're going to do it, I would posit, in the context of social media. And it may be as simple as making sure that among, if you think of Spotify, there could be Canadian playlists. When it comes to social media platforms, how we ensure that there are Canadian choices among the vast array of choices that you can that you have in front of you is, I think, the appropriate one for a regulator to make over time. You can't crystallize those sorts of things in legislation, because just as we couldn't have contemplated the internet when the Broadcasting Act was put in place, and we couldn't imagine the evolution of the business models for streaming services and social media platforms, so too, it is the very job of the regulator to figure out what is appropriate at a particular point in time, because as circumstances and business models change, so too would the need for regulatory adaptation. And I think flexibility is key in such a rapidly changing environment.
I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate you can bring up playlists, because as an artist, I understand how Canadian artists face challenges competing with American conglomerates and resources. And the Broadcasting Act has always ensured that Canadian artists have the resources to grow, to become visibly local, nationally and internationally. And I feel that when Canadians go online, for example, on YouTube or someplace that has a playlist, and they have a hard time discovering any Canadian artists on these platforms, that's a concern for me. I know it's a concern for our Canadian artists and the whole cultural sector. Our artists are the voices of Canadians, and I don't think that those online should be solely exposed to American culture. So you have written that originally drafted Bill C-10, quote, left open the possibility that some platforms such as YouTube might be able to avoid its obligations to make appropriate contributions. And then you went on to state that oversight has now been remedied, and you welcome that correction. So could you explain your comments in more detail? It's that section 4.1, that balance between supporting our artists and protecting our own free speech.
Exactly. And I think the removal of section 4.1 is the one that makes it clear that the social media platforms are within the scope of Bill C-10, which might have been unclear before that. And as I've said, because in my view, the content, the user-generated content, which is still covered by Clause 2.1, is exempt from regulation, I believe there's no threat to freedom of speech, and that users will continue to be as free once Bill C-10 is passed to put whatever content they want online or on social media platforms as they are today.
Thank you. Maybe I'll turn to Mr. Cash. I know I only have a minute, but I just want to say thank you. I've been a member of CIMA for a number of years, so I appreciate your advocacy for all artists out there. You mentioned 80% of the music sector is self-employed. I've been one of them my entire life. And can you explain to everyone the reduced income that happened, the shift to digital? Even CD off sales would be live, would cover artists, but that, or traditional radio play. Can you explain to everyone the amount of revenue that has been lost? I've talked to artists, and I know this, that we're making about 1 penny a quarter from some of these streaming, and the amount of income that's been lost.
Well, it's been widely covered that the streaming services are paying very little for the content that they use, and part of the reason for that is that the market has been so deflated because we've got one massive giant who doesn't need to negotiate with anyone. For the, you're going to license it to YouTube because you want to do something, but that affects Spotify, that affects Apple Music, so there's that. But there's another aspect to this too. SOCAN has just released some statistics that in the digital world, 90% of the royalties that they collect in Canada go to foreign songwriters, and just 10% stays in Canada, as opposed to conventional media. It's about over 30% of the royalties they collect in Canada stay in Canada. That's another key aspect to what we're dealing with here.
Thank you, Mr. Cash.
Thank you.
Okay, we're off to our third round. Ms. Harder for 5 minutes, please. Sorry, Ms. Harder. Yeah, there we go.
My apologies. To my colleague, Mr. Shields, please.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to Mr. Geist. You just heard that the Ms. Yale backs all 97 of the recommendations, including the divisive one that I find that members of the CRTC would be recommended to live in the National Capital Region, which I find problematic. Going beyond that, Social Dilemma is a documentary out there that many have seen, including my granddaughter. And she's a very sharp, of course, all our grandkids are smart. But we discussed this particular bill, and she is very savvy in technology. Now, she understands how algorithms work and how they direct her from her past listening and what she does and directs her to it. But what she objects is the government being involved in doing this. She very does. And this is a very sharp young person, objects the government playing this role. She understands the private sector and their algorithms and how it reflects her. So, Mr. Geist, you've talked about the dollars. We've had members saying this is an emergency. You've described how we can get dollars too. And I think that's the house burning idea. How do we get dollars out? So with the dollar item and what other people have said in the Australian model, would you like to respond to that, how we get there and how Australia is doing it?
Well, certainly I highlight some of that on the media issue, on the newspaper issues that Australia has moved forward on. But to focus specifically on this and an issue that you raised with the algorithms, which I think is important. There's no question that there are concerns. Anyone who's seen some of the movies around social media, I think, comes away rightly concerned about some of these algorithms. But this bill is not a bill that addresses that issue. In fact, it substitutes in some ways the government's choices for the company's choices. What we need instead is more algorithmic transparency on that issue. And this notion that somehow we've got one of the problems we have to solve is discoverability. We've heard it now several times. I must say two things. First, Ms. Yale talked to, as we heard, cross country with lots of people. They weren't able to come up with any evidence, zero, that there is a discoverability issue with user-generated content. There were no studies cited that this is a problem. And the reason is that I'm sometimes left in this discussion wondering if people actually use these services. If you want to find Canadian content on Netflix, type in Canada or Canadian. If you don't think that there are Canadian playlists on Spotify, then perhaps you haven't used Spotify, with all due respect. There are numerous choices for precisely this kind of content. That's not to suggest that we can't do better, but to somehow think that what we need to do is take all the user-generated content, find some mechanism to categorize it as Canadian, and then have the government make choices about what gets prioritized or not, is foolhardy, and that's precisely the reason there is no one else on the planet that does it.
When you say no one else on the planet, and you've repeated that a number of times, and we heard it before, do you hear anybody else even talking about the idea of what Canada or reaction to what Canada is attempting to do?
I think there are significant risks with what we're proceeding, because what this bill will do when you get foreign services looking at Canada, obviously some of the big players already here aren't going to go anywhere, but some of the other services that are outside of the jurisdiction may look at some of these regulations, look at the costs and say, we are going to block Canadian users from the marketplace. You think of a service like Molotov, a French language service that is servicing a whole series of French language African countries. They're not available in Canada right now. Are they going to come into Canada if they face these kinds of regulations? There are India-based services that are the same, Korea-based services that are the same. This is going to hit our multicultural communities particularly hard, as services that might otherwise make themselves available within Canada will look at the costs, look at that what we've already heard are clear obligations that they will face under these rules, and say that we're simply not going to operate in the Canadian market.
So when you referred to a simple tax in the sense of supporting our cultural industries, you would like to see that done, and as a mechanism, we could do that quickly.
Government's already announced it. It's proposed. It's said that it's going to implement a digital services tax starting next year. There are some concerns about moving forward in that regard without an international consensus, but the government's made it clear they want to move forward with that. They've talked about the revenue that is going to generate. It seems to me there is nothing to stop the government saying we are going to take a portion of those proceeds and put them into the very funds that we're talking about right now to support the creators and ensure that there is money now, as opposed to the Bill C-11 approach, Bill C-10 approach that is going to take, as I say, years to sort out through the courts and the CRTC.
Okay, thank you, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Housefather, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And it's been a pleasure to listen to the witnesses today in the vibrant debate. I also want to say that, there have been some people that have been heralded as champions of freedom of expression. I believe that each and every one of the witnesses is a champion of freedom of expression, as are Canadian artists. And as all of the members of the committee, we're all devoted to and care about freedom of expression. I would point out that at the meeting that we had with the Department of Justice officials and Minister Guilbeault last week, I was the only member that asked about whether or not there was interplay with Section 1 and Section 2B of the Charter when it came to discoverability, which is one of the issues that was raised today by Dr. Geist. And I want to walk through with Maître Yale, I'm going to call her Maître Yale because I'm from Quebec, a couple of the issues that I have as questions. So we're going to start from the premise that I think we all agree that users are not governed because of Section 2.1. So the user themselves is not governed. If the user's content is governed, it's solely governed through the online undertaking, which would be governed to a lesser extent in a very specific way, provided that Mr. Brusen's amendment that she's mentioned is adopted by the committee. And those would be, number one, that they would have to disclose their revenues in Canada. I can't imagine that that would be a freedom of expression issue. Number two, they would be required to contribute to Canadian culture. And I can't imagine that that would be a freedom of expression issue. So the only freedom of expression issue, in my view, could lie with a third factor, which is discoverability, which is the only other thing that could be regulated if Mr. Brusen's amendment is adopted. So Ms. Yale, Maître Yale, would it be true in your perspective right now that online undertakings such as social media platforms, I'll use Facebook as an example, can actually censor the content of user posts based on their own documented rules and regulations?
Well, I think we have to be careful about what we mean when we think of social media platforms and the ability of these large tech platforms to intervene in content. So if there is content that they consider illegal, they do today monitor content. So I think it's a bit of a fiction to suggest that there is no regulation of these online. I mean, these undertakings self-regulate because there are no rules of the game, and so they are quite vigilant.
Actually, I wasn't arguing that. I was actually arguing the contrary. I was saying that beyond illegal content, social media providers will frequently say that certain things cannot be posted that are racist, that are not illegal and not hate speech. Their actual rules go beyond, correct?
Absolutely. And that's really the subject for another day as to whether or not the, what I call the lawful but awful content, which they self-regulate today as to what, each platform has its own rules and regulations. Some take it down for different reasons and don't make it available. For sure, there is that going on already. And that was one of the reasons why I made the point that the notion that these algorithms are innocuous is not true. Each platform has its own rules and its own accountability as to what they monitor, what they take down, what they promote, what they push out at you. And so I don't buy the argument that somehow freedom of choice on the part of consumers reigns. It's their commercial interest that dictates to a large extent what you get to see. And so I totally agree with you that I think it's better that we make sure that some of those choices are Canadian ones.
I understand, but just to go beyond, so I agree with you. And getting to the algorithms, we have platforms that are publicly stating, and we know that their algorithms will serve their own private interests, will push people towards different types of content. They will not only go to content that is their preference. In fact, Facebook itself has heralded the fact that if you are searching for Holocaust denial, Facebook will use its algorithms now to redirect you to the Yad Vashem website so that they're making a decision that you should now see the truth about the Holocaust as opposed to the type of lies that you may be stumbling into on their platform. So their algorithms are not subject to the charter, correct, Ms. Yale? Because they're not a government. So their algorithms can be whatever the heck they want them to be.
It's what right now on a global basis, it's whatever they want them to be.
And in the event the CRTC were to have the limited ability to direct the platforms to favor Canadian discoverability of Canadian creators, they wouldn't have the ability to take Canadian creators off the platform based on this amendment. They wouldn't have the ability to tell Canadian creators what to create. They may have to find a way to allow people to search for Canadian artists. And that would be, in the event the CRTC adopted such guidelines, they would have to be in conformity with the charter, correct, Ms. Yale?
Yes.
Mr. Yale?
Yes.
So in fact—
Okay, sorry, Mr. Hessfather, I have to stop it right there.
Thank you.
My apologies.
We'll leave it at yes. I agree with you.
Okay. Mr. Shampoo, for 2 minutes, 30 seconds, please.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Geist, I understand that you do not want for platforms to be regulated regarding the content that they have to offer us. I think that you may have a vision that might ignore the reality that we know in Quebec to protect Francophone culture. And Quebecers are not the only Francophone Canadians. There are also Francophones outside of Quebec. Briefly, could you tell us, do you think it's possible for us to protect Francophone and Quebec culture and Canadian content as well, which I think deserves to be easily discoverable on platforms? Earlier you said it was very easy to find Canadian content. Yes, perhaps it is easy to find some Canadian content, but it is not necessarily showcased, and that is what we are aiming to do. The same way that Canadian broadcasters have to do this. Can you tell me about this?
Sure, I can say a couple of things. First off, I think first, when it comes to some, we need to distinguish between the streaming services again and user-generated content. When we're talking about user-generated content, I think the answer, quite frankly, is no. I don't think that we should be requiring in a user-generated content world a requirement that the CRTC get involved in making some of those choices through discoverability, which, in response a bit to Mr. Housefather's comments, by its very nature, if you are prioritizing some speech, you are deprioritizing other speech. There was a reason in his Facebook example, other content won't be seen. That would be true as well with the CRTC choices for content that is, again, deprioritized. Now, on other kinds of services, on the streaming services, that's a different argument, and that's not really what we're talking about here. I do think that there is some of that content available. Netflix, for example, has the film Juste Déclin, which they themselves funded and doesn't even count as Canadian content. That's part of the problem with the system itself. So I think there are things that can be done. But where we are focused, as we have been, on issues like net neutrality and freedom of expression, what happens is that this bill has slid away from the goals that you've just articulated into now the regulation of individual speech. You can say that it's being done through a platform. You can say that it's indirect, but it ultimately is the case. And to be clear from the start of the premise of your question, I repeat again, I am not against regulating the tech platforms. The issues, especially the discussions we've been having, especially around algorithms, point to the need for greater transparency so that we know how these choices are made, and that is specifically around regulating these platforms. We need better protections around the data they collect. That too is regulating the platforms. We need the Competition Bureau to be more effective in terms of anti-competitive effects. That too is regulation. It is a myth to suggest that this is about whether or not we regulate the tech platforms. This bill, at the end of the day, with these changes, is whether or not we regulate individual speech.
Donc, si on règle cette
question-là. My apologies. Folks, we're going to have time we're going to run over time just a little bit. We have time to finish this off. I have Ms. McPherson, then Mr. Waugh, then Ms. DeBruzen, and then we'll have to call it quits because that would officially be the end of third round. So, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been just such a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank all the experts for bringing their perspectives. I know you don't agree on things, but I think, like I said earlier, that our goal here is to get good legislation for Canadians. I just have to follow up on something that Mr. Shampoo just asked. Mr. Geist, Do you agree with the principle of supporting CanCon? Like, do you believe in CanCon, I guess?
Yes, I absolutely believe in CanCon. I actually think part of the problem that we have faced is that our rules as currently structured do a really inadequate job of ensuring that they adequately reflect Canadian stories. I think there is a problem when you get let's say a production based on a Margaret Atwood book or a Jan Martel book, and the fact that they wrote that book doesn't count for the purposes of Canadian content. I think I think there's a problem with co-productions where we get films that have virtually no connection to Canada at all, and yet they're treated as Canadian content. I wish that the government would take a closer look at what it means to tell Canadian stories and support genuine Canadian content.
So it's the definition of, but the idea of making Canadian content, making it more available, promoting it, ensuring that it is our stories are being told or whatnot, you're supportive of. Do you also agree that like the fact that these web giants do not pay their fiscal fair share, do you feel like I feel like that is a gift from the government to these web giants at the expense of our cultural sector, at the expense of our cultural enterprises and our cultural sovereignty? And so how would we fix this so that we're not giving the web giants the gift, we're giving our cultural sectors these gifts?
Tax. I mean, the obvious way that we ensure that these companies contribute into the Canadian economy, if they are as successful as we've been saying, is ensure that we tax them appropriately and have the revenues coming out of that taxation to use as we see fit. That's obvious. The reality is that some of these companies are major investors in the country. I mean, the former Heritage Minister Jolie went out and got a $500 million commitment over 5 years to ensure that there was investment in production in Canada. So it's not as if they produce nothing. Just Des Clans is a good example, Trailer Park Boys or others for Netflix. So we could cite many of these kinds of examples. So I don't think it's correct to say that they don't contribute anything or they aren't producing in Canada. They quite clearly are. But I think it is fair to say, are they paying their fair share from a tax perspective? There's evidence to suggest that the way the system has been structured, they have not, and we need to fix that. And with that tax revenue, we can do all of this without blowing up the Broadcasting Act in this manner and directly implicating the expression of users.
So you would see taxation instead of broadcasting legislation? Is that?
No, absolutely not. I would like to update our broadcasting law to be a forward-looking law, not one that seeks to have a false equivalency and say that the only way we can do this is to look backwards and treat internet companies as the same as could conventional broadcasters, which is what we are seeking to do and increasingly finding a myriad of problems when that's the regulatory approach that you take. So let's get the Broadcasting Act right for now and for the future, and let's at the same time ensure that there is revenues there through taxation.
Thank you, Dr. Geis. Mr. Waugh, for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll share my time with Mr. Aitchison, but the elephant in the room to me is the CRTC, the lack of confidence that Canadians have in the CRTC. Many of us have been former broadcasters right now, zooming in here, but there is little or no confidence in the CRTC. And then when we see a former chair and vice chair and others speaking out to this bill, that in itself is the white flag that I think we are all concerned about and must address as we go forward in this bill. Mr. Geis, I'll just give it to you because, being a former broadcaster, we had very little confidence in the CRTC at all.
Well, I think there's been ongoing frustration for many, many years with the CRTC. I find it almost astonishing now to people say, well, let's just leave almost all these issues to the CRTC and they can figure it out. This bill, as I think, frankly, many of the members from all parties will recognized, is woefully lacking in detail. And it was supposed to be in a policy directive. That policy directive didn't contain much information either. And so on issue after issue after issue, it said, well, let's let the CRTC solve it. You've had the CRTC chair acknowledge there isn't great expertise necessarily now on these issues either. And for anyone that has ever followed these issues, you know that the CRTC process, think of some of the telecom issues that have been going on for years. We are talking about very lengthy processes. So when I hear Mr. Cash, for example, talk about the urgency of getting some of these issues right, that strikes me as wholly incompatible with this legislative strategy that is going to take years to ensure that there is actual money on the ground. And we are handing it over to a commission that has that groups from across the spectrum have really struggled with and felt that they sometimes have either been excluded, the decisions haven't been correct, it's taken a long period of time. There's a reason that there's that lack of confidence.
Mr. Aitchison, take my time.
Thank you very much. I guess my question might actually be either for Ms. Yale and or Mr. Trudell. I'm wondering, it feels like in some ways we're trying to reinvent the wheel here a little bit. And I'm wondering if, we haven't looked to other jurisdictions. I'm thinking specifically about Australia, where they have come up with a threshold for revenue and the number of subscribers before they get regulated, for example, before they do this kind of thing. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, why we wouldn't follow the same kind of a model that Australia has used, as opposed to what feels like, I think what Dr. Geist just said, kind of really, really loosely throwing or punting sort of authority to the CRTC to come up with specific regulations, and then just kind of casting a very wide net here, which strikes me as sloppy and maybe even a bit dangerous. So I specifically Australia, why we wouldn't follow their lead.
Well, let me start. First of all, this is looking forward, not looking back regulation, because if you look at the way in which streaming services and sharing platforms would be brought into the Act, it's not a licensing model. It's a registration model, which already is substantially less onerous. And it doesn't involve interfering with business models, what content you produce, what kind of content you produce, how you offer it. It is really a very simple mechanism. And so I would say that this is...
Sorry, it is my time, and it feels like you're answering something that Dr. Geist was talking about. I'm specifically asking about...
And
sorry, I didn't mean to...
Right. And so what I was going to say as a consequence then is the fundamental issue in that the regulator always grapples with is whether or not the service in question is going to make a material contribution to the objectives of Canadian broadcasting policy. And in our report, and as practiced by the CRTC, they do create exemption thresholds. So whether or not you put those in legislation or in regulation, at the end of the day, you're absolutely correct that there will be thresholds below which these rules wouldn't apply. Revenue thresholds, subscriber thresholds. And, that is the job of the CRTC, in my view, to do. And we certainly talked about that in our report because, of course, over time, what those thresholds should be would change. And so I don't think it's a problem to leave that to the regulator and to focus on the big players and to come up with a reasonable threshold, as you've suggested has been done in other jurisdictions, below which there would be no regulation.
So sorry, instead of going to Mr. Trudell, am I out of time?
Yeah, I'm afraid you are, just barely. Ms. DeBruzen, you get the final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my first question goes to Ms. Yale, and I was happy because we talked a little bit about not just 2.1 and then the removal of 4.1, but also the amendment that I had put forward, 11.1, which really restricts what the CRTC powers would be as far as obligations for social media companies to reporting revenue made in Canada, contributing a portion of that revenue to Canadian cultural production funds. But the other part being that the discoverability requirement would be different from that which applies to radio and television. It is actually only for the discoverability of Canadian creators of programs, and it doesn't have the system that we think of when we think about traditional broadcasters. So taking into account that very restricted scope that's being proposed as far as application to the social media platforms and the full exclusion of the application to people who are posting their content, do you think that this bill should move ahead?
Absolutely. I think there's a real sense of urgency, as a number of committee members have pointed out. These platforms, streaming and sharing platforms, are extracting huge value from Canada through delighting audiences and reaping advertising and subscription revenues. And on a simplified basis, as you've described, they would be required to make a contribution and to ensure that the Canadian choices are made visible to for people to choose from. And I think that's a great thing and a really important step in the right direction.
Thank you. Et Monsieur Trudel.
And Mr. Trudel, I'd like to ask you the same question. Given that there is 2.1, and then there's the amendment that I have proposed, 11.1. Do you think that we should continue with this bill? Yes, I think that, as amended, this bill provides additional guarantees and does a great job at closing the doors, reduces to zero the possibility that the CRTC at any given time would make a decision that would in any way violate internet users' freedom. Thank you.
I really only have 2 minutes left, but going back to Ms. Yale, since really you were at the start of this with the report and all of the consultations that you did you have just a closing comment for us as we end this discussion today?
Well, I would say that what really struck us was the sense of urgency on the part of the Canadian creative community. It is true that some of these platforms and streaming services spend money in Canada on service productions, but the real test from a cultural policy perspective is whether or not their investments in productions where the key creative positions are held by Canadians. That's what's going to ensure that there is a vibrant cultural sector in Canada. And from a cultural policy perspective, we think that we strongly believe from what we heard from coast to coast to coast was that we needed to bring these online services into the legislation and to ensure that they make an appropriate contribution to Canadian cultural policy. And so we heard that loud and clear wherever we went.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. That brings us to an end. I have an important question at the end, but before I do that, I just want to say a huge thank you to our guest today as we put together this panel. And I agree with all my colleagues who said quite clearly that this has been a great discussion, and I would agree it has been a great discussion. That being said, I want to say thank you, Mr. Cash. Thank you for joining us. I want to say thank you to Ms. Yale for joining us, Professor Trudel, thank you, and as well, Dr. Geis. Thank you very much to the four of you. Fantastic job today. It was really impressive. Now, that being said, we have now, folks, unless I'm getting this wrong, we have satisfied the motion as to what we wanted. We do have a submission by the Justice Department regarding their interpretation or their update on the charter statement. We have heard from Mr. Guilbeault. I guess we're going to hear from Mr. Guilbeault again tomorrow, as well as we're going to hear from Mr. Minister Lametti tomorrow also. They are going to be here for an hour. So what I'm suggesting is one of two things. We start clause by clause, following the 1 hour from ministers, or we can continue with it on Wednesday at the same time, because we do have tomorrow and we do have Wednesday as well, where we start clause by clause will be G11.1, the amendment that Ms. de Bruzen just mentioned a short time ago. Let me go to the list. Monsieur Reyes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to what you are proposing, if the committee agrees, tomorrow we are going to hear from the Justice Minister, as you pointed out. And here's what I propose. After his 1 hour appearance, we adjourn the committee, or we take care of technical matters amongst ourselves, and then we come back to clause by clause on Wednesday. This would give everyone a chance to analyze everything that was said Friday, Monday, what our witnesses said today. Because there was a lot of content, as you said, our witnesses today really enlightened us with a lot of information. And there is not just one point of view on these matters, there are many, and the different points of view were very well represented. I want to emphasize what a great job the witnesses did today. So I recommend that tomorrow we adjourn after the ministers 1 hour, and then we come back on Wednesday at the hour you said, and this would give us the time to review our material. Because the interventions by ministers tomorrow will have repercussions on our orientations for clause by clause.
C'est ma proposition.
That is my proposal.
Seeing no further discussion on that, nobody else wants to have an opinion. I'm going to exercise my own bit of discretion here and say I would agree. How about we, tomorrow we'll hear from both ministers. It may run a little bit over an hour, who knows, but we'll do it at that point, and then we can adjourn, and the following day we can pick up clause by clause on Wednesday with 11.1. That being said, I see thumbs up. Okay with that? Oh, sorry, Mr. Champoux.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, in the same vein, I also have a proposal or a suggestion. Given that we won't be using the second hour for work, could you think of the number of turns that we'll be able to complete for questioning in that 1 hour? Will we be able to have a time to carry out our rounds of questions without any constraints? That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, and that's valid, Mr. Champoux. I tell you what, I try to get in as I try to do is get the first round done, and then with 6 minutes each, then on to the second round. As we go on to the second round, I try to complete the first I try to complete 4 questions in the first round, 4 questions in the second round as well. All right, so let's just say I try to get that done. I'm assuming that the minister will stick around for at that point. We usually get it. If we go over, it's only 5 or 10 minutes, but I will endeavor to have 2 rounds of questioning, 4 in each round, representing each of the 4 recognized parties. Any discussion on that? Since our guests are still here, I just want to say thank you again for that fantastic discussion. Very well done. Okay, folks, that's it. Thank you, and we will see you again tomorrow at 2:30 Eastern. Meeting adjourned.